Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's great to see some familiar faces and some faces we haven't seen before. We hope to see you again in our series, Politics of Liberation. Today, it's our great pleasure to have with us Professor Susan Robertson. I am personally very moved because I know Susan from my days at Bristol University. Thank you very much, Susan, for joining us. Susan will talk to us today about something that is extremely relevant to what's going on in Greece as well. So issues around higher education, the neoliberalization of higher education, and how to go on with this. So Susan's talk is titled Just Educational Futures, and as I can see, and the Politics of Liberation. So Susan, the floor is yours.
So thank you so much, Rosa and Georgia, to offer this invitation. It's just a wonderful occasion, a wonderful event, and a wonderful series. And I do want to take quite seriously the theme, the politics of liberation. And the way my talk will develop is I want to do some diagnostic work on quite a big, important debate that's going on amongst political scientists particularly, but also our economist friend Thomas Piketty, on essentially education is the salvation really for liberatory politics. Okay, that's in a nutshell what the argument is. And I'm going to query that, and I'm going to put forward a case, and it's a case, though it's a specific case, and it's the case of England. What I want to show with that case is that, in fact, unless we do this much more situated and closer kind of analysis of the kind of dynamics at work, what we do is that we miss something of the not inconsequential granularity that actually makes a certain kind of politics possible. I want to do it kind of thinking with the wonderful Rosa Luxemburg with us. It's the Institute here is hosting this event, but we've got a great deal to learn from the kind of writing that she was doing about 100 years ago. And more or less, the kinds of politics that we're swimming in at the moment are not that different from the kinds of politics that were swirling around when Luxemburg is actually having to not just engage, she engaged in teaching herself, in her writing, but particularly in her organising, her collaborations and dialogues with Lenin, her difficulties at times with her own kind of the party politics actually. So it, and then I want to actually come to, and so where would the politics of liberation actually come from if what I'm actually saying about education actually is the case. I'm not going to claim that in fact all education systems, and I'll focus specifically on higher education. I've got some of my own doctoral students working on the emergence of a left in Chile, the difficulties nevertheless in Chile to land a redrafting of the constitution, but nevertheless that's been a project in the making in Chile since the students began organising around about 2006, the Penguin movement. So I want to start essentially by kind of recognising that for the moment anyway, education itself seems to kind of be brought centre stage, and it's being asked to do a lot of work around reimagining what a future might begin to look like. And that ranges from multilateral agencies like the OECD, and we'll see this, I'll raise some questions in relation to UNESCO's International Commission on the Futures of Education. They put their report out at the end of 2021. I also want to actually place firmly on the table that the big corporations and the big tech corporations have absolutely got education in its sight. venture capitalists are investing seriously and large amounts of money, and they run arguments around the industrial model of education, and in fact actually you can look at now Alphabet was Google, classrooms, huge amounts of investment that's gone in, particularly through the COVID period. And we know why that's the case, because essentially the ed tech firms essentially see that's where the money is to be made. But we also have organised labour, and I would want to say that, in fact, I've been privileged, actually, to work with Education International, big global union that represents teachers, whether they're academic teachers or school teachers, or even actually non-state organised teachers, and been campaigning with them over a number of years around the kind of the excessive privatising that's gone on. At the same time, I also do want to say that social movements, that some of them are actually naming the cognitive empire, and I'll come back to this this idea. And the argument kind of, they range over the idea that we should have personalised learning, or we could perhaps have social movement learning through forms of organising to generate greater degrees of democracy, and so on. And it even goes to some of the big Tencent, who Charles Yadan has made an amazing amount of money from TikTok. He also invests significantly, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, in trying to kind of shape futures of education. So this is a recent report that came from UNESCO. Some of the best intellectuals were brought together, that include Morozov, who's writing most recently in the New Left Review around techno-feudalism. Included in that group too are people like Arjun Appadurai. So these are intellectuals, many on the left, but not exclusively, politicians and so on. But And the call was to reimagine. So typically UNESCO will undertake these kinds of very significant reviews. The reports come out there typically every decade. We had the Delors report, the 70s was the Fore report, and so on. And it strikes me that these are potentially opportunities to undertake what I'm going to say, some serious diagnosis of the situation that we find ourselves in today, and particularly a diagnosis around commercialisation, privatisation, marketisation. We could use lots of different words to begin to describe the erosion, fundamentally, of the knowledge-producing institutions that, for sure, social reproduction, but it doesn't get entirely reduced to those things. But if you take a search of that document, what you'll see is the word capitalism never appears, ever. And I kind of did you'll have odd kind of gestures in the direction of marketising, or what is nicely called non-state actors. But come on, these are big corporations with huge investments, not just directly going into education via platforms, but actually the Gates Foundation, but they're not the only ones, they're the obvious ones. Incredibly busy. All the big corporates have foundations, and many of them are actually very busy shaping education policy. It's not actually what comes out the other end, scholarships and things like that, which was the old form of philanthropy. This is venture philanthropy, okay? Shaping up education systems in the kind of mirror image of the kind of social relations that represent the kind of social relations that they've brought into the conditions for capitalism fundamentally. So I want to now turn to, so this is UNESCO, but it's in all cases, what connects a number of these different interlocutors that we're going to look at, and UNESCO, is a concern with rising social inequalities, big issues around climate change, major concerns around the breakdown of social bonds, and even the conditions for the reproduction of capitalism itself. It needs forms of social cohesion. Otherwise, what you have is kind of anarchy in societies and so on. And here's Piketty himself actually reflecting on, as the others have too, rising social inequalities, and that in fact actually that the rise and the rise and the rise, and particularly from 2008, but it goes on, starts beginning, even the OECD is naming growing social inequalities and the implications of growing social inequalities for societies prior to 2007, 2008. And what we know from all of the work that came out, Piketty, we could Strake, all of those that are actually writing, Brankovic and others. What we see is a kind of a takeoff after the 2008 crisis of, the upward movement of wealth, being concentrated in a tiny and an even tinier kind of group, elite. And in fact, actually, it's interesting. I was looking at some figures, not so much looking at that, but if you took the wealth of the big 5 edtech firms and put that wealth together, that wealth is about the same wealth as the GDP of Germany, of the United Kingdom, and of France. I mean, so you see, not just in the big corporates, but you see concentrations of wealth amongst a very tiny kind of group. And Piketty does an interesting kind of analysis of that in Capitalism, or Capital, it's not capitalism, that was the problem in the 21st century. The book that I actually want to engage with here is his more recent work. So it's thinking about the ongoing problems of inequality, and has become quite interested and quite taken with cleavage theory. And cleavage theory fundamentally is drawing on work that had taken place, reflecting on where you actually see the occupational organisation and occupations and different income groups, and how that kind of maps on particularly into voting, so political preferences and so on. And what they're looking at the current time is, in fact, actually what you might be able to also say about the rise of populism, to some extent left populism, but mostly it's actually about right populism. So in Capital and Ideology, and he works with very big teams here, it's kind of like a big data kind of world of political science here, reflecting on growing social inequalities. Kind of looks lovingly, in many senses, at the 30 glorious years, as Hobsbawm kind of characterised it, but actually falls here and says essentially every human society must justify its inequalities. Every epoch, therefore, develops a range of contradictory discourses and ideologies for the purposes of legitimising the inequalities that already exist, or that people believe should exist. From these discourses emerges certain economic, social and political rules, which people then use to make sense of the ambient social structure. But essentially the kind of criticism is the same criticism that was launched of him and his big team to do with capitalism in capital in the 21st century, and that is that he engages with capital, but less so with capitalism per se. And like in the previous Capital in the 21st century, there was a kind of lazy, I would say, innocently lazy, not willfully lazy. That education, the future was in education. You invest in education. And at the time, I wrote an article for the British Journal of, there's a special issue on education sociology, kind of critiquing that kind of almost innocent kind of glancing over at education as if nothing had happened in the world of education, that somehow it sat on a shelf beyond neoliberalism. There was no processes of commodification actually taking place, and in fact actually it was kind of a race between technology and education in capital in the 21st century. In this particular case, what Piketty and others are potentially kind of interested in is, you know, and I think it's kind of well motivated to some extent, is can we kind of see shifts that are starting to take place in part because of changes in the kind of occupational structures. In other words, large industry, industrialisation looks rather different than the rise of service-based economies, the kinds of occupations that we actually see there. Just a couple of things around the kind of big data set that he uses to draw on. In this particular case, Piketty and colleagues are actually looking at post-Soviet countries, Latin American and Western, so-called Western democracies to develop their analysis. And essentially the question is this: is the rise in levels of higher education across different societies a consequence of the transition to a knowledge society, in turn transforming values, political alliances and voting behaviour? Because what we can see essentially is some interesting kinds of shifts where some of the working class would appear to be shifting across and voting, let's say, for Trump, the old working class. And what you can also see, and if we took Jeremy Corbyn and UK-based politics, they were able to enrol incredibly well-educated, middle-class kids into the Labour Party. And in fact, actually, it was probably the largest, the biggest left party right across Europe. And you can see this as a potentially kind of seductive thing here, that in fact actually where would liberatory politics actually begin to come from? It might well come from the better educated, and so therefore you might assume that more education is actually going to create the possibilities for a politics of liberation, which is what makes it interesting for this particular theme. For this year's theme that we're speaking to. And do these left-right shifts in voting patterns represent, and this is where they're going, it's the realignment or cleavage theory, a new realignment or along new lines of cleavage. So in this particular case, these lines of cleavage are actually to do with education and income. And if so, what are the implications of this? So I want to just reflect on several kind of research groups that have actually got into this kind of debate. And you see a fairly binarized and actually, to some extent, I would probably say, somewhat nasty education cleavage. But this got a lot of press actually when it came out in 2017. Bovis and Weil, or Willie. It's I think they're from Belgium, research group, and they represent it this way: tell us what your highest diploma is, and we'll tell you who you are and what you do. You'll be a university graduate. You watch. Okay, so now these are cultural attributes. The kind of things that you actually read, what you do with your school children, what schools do they go to, where do you go on holidays, what are your cultural pursuits, and so on. By way of contrast, we have now, and these are supposedly, and you can see mapped onto this here, are the so-called ignorant, nationalist, nativist, working class, populist, right populist voter. Okay, Brexit, for example, would be a good example here, or the vote that's going off in the direction of Trump. So this is a quite binarized, it's quite identifying kind of these kind of cultural attributes. And here in this particular case, we'll basically say that your career ended after junior high school, so you've not gone on to university. This is your cultural pursuits, this is where your children go to school, this is where you take holidays, and so on. Now, in the background here is, in the cleavage theory arguments, is the idea of that the transition, and I'm using these words quite deliberately because these are the words used by these researchers, the transition away from a period of industrialisation, okay, a la Daniel Bell's arguments, into a knowledge-based society. Okay, society, deliberately I'm choosing here, and it's the kind of language that they're actually using, results in a more knowledgeable, cosmopolitan, tolerant, this is our well-educated, and a intolerant, rather ignorant, nativist, anti-race, and certainly anti-asylum-seeking populations, and so on. So now what we've got is the idea that the rise of the knowledge economy, which education, but specifically higher education, delivers, or is kind of tasked with delivering, and I'll say something about that a little bit further on, has actually delivered a cosmopolitan elite that's now voting to the left, and a rather ignorant, nationalist, nativist, rightist, populist kind of working class. So left has gone right, and right has gone left. And more recently, I actually gave the annual lecture for Thesis 11 around left, right, out. So we can go left, right, but we can also look at them as populations that have been left, right, out. But that's not the kind of argument that's being developed here. This is quite binarised. It's teleological. There's a kind of an assumption that simply we've just moved somehow. Perhaps the magic hand of the market, or the hidden hand of the market, has just moved these societies kind of on to this other state. Now, let me remind you, when Daniel Bell was writing this venture in social forecasting, when he puts out this idea of the rise of the kind of knowledge society, it was a venture in social forecasting. And what Bell's doing at the time is casting around at the end of the 50s, going into the 60s, for where might the accumulation strategy come from. Okay? Because if the production of goods has actually been deindustrialised down into bits of Mexico, but particularly out into the Asian world, then the developed economies have got a major problem on their hands, and that is, what's the basis of accumulation? Now, this is where Rosa Luxemburg's work is incredibly important. Her fabulous and only kind of extended work, which is the accumulation of capital. And the bits that for me are particularly interesting kind of come in at around about page 360, kind of 365 thereabouts. And there's a number of insights that she's actually developing. But capitalism has always been incredibly good around looking for new markets, using the globe to actually do that. The country that I actually come from, Australia, essentially we get the kind of the dispossession of the indigenous populations as you get an expansion outward, and it wasn't simply just about placing any of the Irish and the Scottish that you didn't get on with into the colony. This was also about a politics of extraction that begins to take place. Now, Piketty doesn't do quite the same thing, but he accepts the cleavage theory argument, the transition to a knowledge economy. But he becomes quite interested in essentially in capital and ideology, drawing on electoral surveys, 50 elective democracies here, going right back historically. Much of the data is a little bit dodgy, so they're having to develop proxies, but comes up with his quite seductive, what's called the Brahmin left and the merchant right. And we can see these kinds of things happening. So we can look at high and low education, and we can look at high and low income. And we can begin to place people with high and low, and combinations of this across into these different kinds of quadrants. I mean, Joran Thurbon's done a lovely piece in the New Left Review, if you want to chase that down, developing a really significant critique of, to some extent, a lost opportunity. It suggests that, in fact, actually, there's not the kind of attention to the kind of granularity that you would kind of expect, and certainly not any great attention to some of the kinds of specificities in place that would become important to enable us to say something about, even what would constitute the left. So if you look at the left in the UK, the left is not recognisable as much of the left. It's quite centrist, if not to the right. And that's, Blair takes it in that direction. It's the reason why Corbyn really can't get any traction politically. Words like socialism basically kind of chase people like Corbyn and others trying to kind of push for at least some kind of redistribution of some kind. So the first question is, what does it even mean to think about the left and the right in this particular case? Isn't looking at political manifestos at all, simply just takes, and in fact actually just takes, so the educated, the high education, or the educated in this case, as opposed to low education, high education, is the top 10%. And the other 90% are the less well-educated, undereducated of sorts. It's not the kind of statistic that Bovens and Wiles are actually using, but in this particular case, more or less fundamentally, you're just thinking about masters and PhD students. The census data, and we'll look at it a little bit later, has come out in England literally about 2 weeks ago. And those with at least an undergraduate degree, if not more, is 33.8%. That's really high. It's not your top 10%. I mean, that's a large number. And actually, if you look at London, it's in the vicinity, the concentration of that credential, being highly educated in London, is in the vicinity of about 60%. And not all of them are working for the services industries at all. You'd probably have very large numbers of perhaps asylum seekers, refugees, people with high levels of education but quite low levels of income, actually, in that regard. And actually the ethnic element, which Piketty doesn't pick up on at all, in fact actually does quite a bit of the explaining of some of this kind of left politics. So what we have, and there's a bit of a critique that's kind of launched here, because really the so-called Brahmin left, and it doesn't hold for all the countries at all by any stretch of the imagination. In many countries included in this 50 that in fact actually don't look anything like this. So, like, there's no shifts. And in fact actually the cleavages would be more likely to be described as gender-based or religious, for example, in Iran. But nevertheless, these are very big claims. Now, it matters that it's Piketty, because Piketty is very busy, working alongside left-wing political parties, trying to organise their kind of left-wing manifestos. And what Piketty's answer to the issue of how would we actually get some kind of shift in the direction of liberatory politics or a politics of liberation is simply to say, let's have more higher education. Now, you can read that at the surface level, where it looks as if you've got a high level of education, but the question is, what's the nature of the politics that might that might be going into. But the other kind of issue here is that there's simply an assumption that one caused the other, that your access to higher education caused a kind of left-leaning politics, as if there's something particularly kind of substantive about the knowledge production taking place in that place. And so my argument really here is that surely you'd have to be looking to some extent at knowledge production practices in the institutions, and you would somehow have to develop an account of how is it that in fact higher education, certainly in the case of England, has been almost so thoroughly marketised that in fact that's the kind of outcome we get. I mean, correlations are not causes, and so it's the fallacy of a correlation being asked to do some causal kind of analysis here. There's another group, they've been doing this work, US-based scholars, Shelton Ryan. They're somewhat more complicated in their analysis. They make some similar kinds of claims. This is the transition to a knowledge society. But essentially what they start to do is they look at whether in fact in terms of education you're progressive or regressive, and in terms of income, whether your politics actually goes off in the direction of more kind of more liberal or less, more authoritarian orientation to politics. And so they come up with slightly different kinds of results to Piketty. And in fact, nevertheless, state, so I'd say probably the problems in this kind of analysis is the kind of the easy assumption that the transition to knowledge societies has created this left-right kind of shift. But they do find some ambivalences kind of in the middle. There's a kind of a middle group that they can identify where essentially, and it's this middling group where they can go either way, essentially. And they are also kind of arguing too in this, and so departing company to some extent with Piketty, that in fact that in fact what you've got is these kind of cross or diagonal kind of pressures kind of in there, and it would be those groups essentially that you would actually as a political party have to capture, that kind of middle that could go right or it could go left. But what they also find, unlike Piketty, is that in fact you've also got a well-educated that has got also high income, so well-educated high income that also go to some extent to the left, but they could also go to the right. So they're a particularly interesting kind of group. Now, the kind of what's sitting behind some of this, and then I'll kind of get into the case and I'll get a little bit of kind of pace behind this, is the kind of work by Daniel Usch, who's actually looking at, and rightly kind of saying this, that in fact actually the occupational structures look very different to those that we saw through the industrialisation period. The old working class is not the same working class as the new working class. They're largely in the services sector. They're dominated by now growth in female. But they also argue that in fact actually, and this is the bit that I want to highlight to you, that what would explain the left vote for them is those who are the new working class, the new kind of middle working class, or to some extent, if put professors in here, these would be the well-paid. Okay, all of you here, if you're professors, you're well-paid, and you're also voting to the left. Okay, so you're high income and to the left, and well-educated. And I'm not sure that in fact that actually stacks up. I mean, there's been huge amounts of erosion of proletarianising of work. There might be a few stars that kind of make it through. But what Oosh, and this is what's interesting. So, what would explain for Oosh the shift to the left? And Oosh argues that, in fact, it's the what he calls the interpersonal work logic. So, if you engage in people-to-people work, and the assumption here for Oosh is that you work for the state. The expansion of the state welfare, you work for the state, and so you've got an interest in kind of protecting your state-based jobs, but you're also engaged in kind of person-to-person work. So this is care, education, health, and so on, and that would, for Oosh, kind of account. And many of these writers, all writing in and around this area, actually draw on Oosh's work, as does Oosh's in more recent publications, a 2016 one. Now, several things I think are really important to observe here. Many of the public sectors have actually been outsourced if they've not been privatised. And much of the so-called public sector, even if the state is underwriting the public sectors, have actually embraced full-on neoliberalism with its fetishising of individualism, competition, and innovation, as Richard Sennett would describe it. And so it raises doubts in my head, short of actually doing some empirical work, as to what the kind of causal mechanism might well be. Nevertheless, that's the kind of question that is actually being pursued. So this is where it boils down to. If the level, so I'm repeating the issue also raised earlier by Piketty, is if higher education is a key variable in voting left, then essentially now we'd see the basis for some kind of political agenda. Now, the work that I've been doing with a colleague, and I just want to acknowledge some of the opportunities to work with some fantastic colleagues, particularly in Cambridge. And what we've been interested in doing in this work has been kind of looking at some kind of paradoxical kinds of developments. So this is Jonathan Measures, and he's reflecting on the same problem that Piketty is reflecting on, and that is that we see a rise in social inequalities, but what we don't see is a parallel rise in concern for significant social inequalities. And what Measures does in looking at big survey data and so on, is to actually look at, and we can see the case of the United Kingdom here, United States, is that in fact, and this is the way it goes, the more unequal you are, the more on the world values surveys and so on, the data sets that they're kind of looking at, is to actually say that it's your individual merit. Okay? By contrast, the more equal societies in the survey data, they've got quite big kind of value data and so on, is the more equal societies would actually attribute it to structural reasons. If you don't get ahead, it's because you don't have access to social, cultural, economic capital and so on. But the more unequal societies, you attribute it to yourself. Now, we shouldn't be surprised by this. What neoliberalism is kind of up to is you get ahead on your own, it's your investment in yourself, and this comes by way of Friedman, Becker, and others. And so the question then would be, you can't presume then, so if we complicate the story a little bit, more education in a society that has embraced neoliberalism and is now much more unequal is much more likely, actually, to not have you shift necessarily to the left, but in fact actually just kind of almost embrace a politics of kind of individualism. And we might have left votes, but it may not be a vote in the direction of solidarity. It may well be a direction and redistribution. It may well be a vote in the direction of simply trying to secure your opportunity to get ahead in the race, fundamentally. This is really interesting work. So what I'm going to do is just quickly summarise, and then I'm going to show you. I'm going to develop a slightly different argument here. So we've got Piketty, and we've kind of Piketty and Bovens and Willie, and the problems of that. We've got Usha's kind of work. We can see with Mija's, we can see actually that meritocracy is being mobilised to justify inequalities. Those kinds of accounts, despite Piketty being on the left, in my view, offer us a bourgeois kind of understanding of the dynamics that are taking place. And what I want to do is I want to go off in the direction of some of the insights. Rosa Luxemburg, probably the foremost thinker at the moment. It would also, in this kind of territory, would be Nancy Fraser's work, Cannibal Capitalism, The Old is Dying and the New Can't Be Born. But she's been on this kind of track of analysis for quite some time. And actually, at some point, I know in Germany actually gave one of the Rosa Luxemburg lectures drawing on Rosa Luxemburg's accounts. And so so I want to take a case, and I'll develop the case kind of quite quickly here. But essentially, in this case, it's important that we actually look at economies, not in the abstract sense of would it be feasible, often as Marx was doing, but actually to try and look at kind of the real economy, what we actually see kind of actually going on here. And again, I want to thank some of my doctoral students who've been working with me on some of these kind of analyses of shifting discourses, Michele Martini particularly, but I've got other of my doctoral students who are actually working on politics, left politics in places like Chile and so on. And what I want to actually do here is to actually be very clear that, in fact, all of this is work to go into a form of primitive accumulation, and then to more or less kind of deliver a much more kind of full-blown market, as we see in higher education in the case of the UK, has required a huge amount of political work driven forward by the state. That state and those political elites are backed by economic elites, and there's been some wonderful work, theory, culture and society, and reporting on some of those kind of elisions between the economic and the political elite, and you can see how that kind of would happen. But Quinn Slobodian would also make the incredibly important point, and he's one of the foremost kind of analysts at the moment, doing some beautiful work around rereading and reading again neoliberalism. Because what's at stake and what's at issue here is to have the state do the work to help create the market, institute the market, but fundamentally to put economy beyond politics. And you do that through trade agreements. And that's some of the work that I've actually been doing. And I've done that for the unions. So this economy, a so-called knowledge society, there were two possibilities running through the 90s. It comes down in the direction of a knowledge economy. We don't talk about a knowledge society anymore. So I find it really interesting that Piketty and others do that. And there are kind of epistemic losses when you actually don't acknowledge quite what is at work. The OECD, the World Bank kind of get in there in the 1990s, and the knowledge-based economy sits on four pillars. One is the fetishizing of the digital. The second is the investment, particularly in higher education, human capital. The third is around innovations, but institutions that might both drive but also capture innovation, intellectual property. And the fourth element of that is to have a kind of a pro-market economy. The bank, Knowledge for Development, that project went looking around at all of the different economies around the world and who was transitioning, and the bank's job was to kind of be the handmaiden and the OECD into this kind of transition into a particular knowledge economy. Now, knowledge is not innocent. And one of the points that Rosa Luxemburg makes too is that what we have is, the kind of forms of imperialism that would include the cognitive empire, as Santos would describe it. So if these investments in higher education and the privileging of certain kinds of curriculum, here I think of economics, that basically gets us into trouble, ACCA, the 2008 crisis, and so on it goes. So there's a refashioning, so the effort to make markets, trade and education services, movement, let's say, of students across borders, capacity building was talked about, Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, all of those countries, in fact, had not invested significantly in the making of their own institutions. And this would be where you could actually make now new markets. What was important about this kind of moment was, in fact, actually the parallel institution, the World Trade Organization, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, because that locks in the economy and the interests of the economy from politics. Okay? Any nation that wanted to renationalise would have to pay significant amounts of money back to the investors that got involved in investing in education services. And I've written quite extensively on that, and there are cases we can see. And it happens across a number of different industries. North American Trade Agreement operates in the same way, many cases there. The WTO basically gets into trouble, there are lots of protests, a lot of stalling and so on. And it's not to say that those negotiations go away. 2006 and the Services Directive in Europe essentially locks in, and even for the UK at the time, the right for any of those getting involved in investing in education to have their investments honoured in. So what would be your losses into the future if these were to be kind of taken back into the renationalised fundamentally? So there's a huge amount of work. I want to argue that operates at multi-scales. You don't run politics at the scale where you're going to get a lot of protest and resistance. You run politics at either a global, where it's not organised, or even at a regional, and I mean at the European scale, when people are not organised either in terms of labour unions at that kind of level. And it is that the Services Directive that in fact was quite instrumental to enable some of the development of the economy, the creation of globally competitive and market in the case of the UK. I want to acknowledge now here the work of Michele Martini, who's a wonderful semiotician and has been working with me. And what we've been looking at is all of the big HE reports. And what we're interested in is whether, in fact, we can see discursively the kind of work, let's say, that the HE reports, higher education reports, are engaged in. The first one, the Deering Review, which is, I'd say, is the moment of primitive accumulation, softening up, potentially fees, raising issues about it not being affordable. Certainly international students are moving in and out and on different fee structures to what they actually have now. But it's that kind of conversation that's being raised in the Deering report that ultimately sets up the conditions for the creditors, loan companies and so on to ultimately get involved. And they become quite important, the financialisation of the sector and that faction of capital that's become incredibly important. You'll see the second report here, and these are actually, these are not just dots chosen, these represent kind of value or volume. So the second one, Race to the Top, was the Sainsbury Review. It's essentially making the strong case for universities to now drive the knowledge-based economy. Innovation, patenting, entrepreneurs, all of those individuals that now become the new, embrace the social relations and the new mode of accumulation for the expansion of capitalism, both internally and kind of externally, because of course any of these innovations that might be being developed in universities will be taken to market and scaled up. But I'm going to come to make some interesting kind of observations. The Brown Review, just quickly, is to essentially erase academics out. The focus is on students as fee payers. Now they're the consumers, to enable for-profit providers to enter into the sector. They couldn't access the student loan company at all, and they couldn't either as a venture capitalist, but they can now. And success as a knowledge economy, essentially, look for the word university in the last one. Disappeared. So now what we've got is a changed entity. The university has disappeared. The identity of the university is now only one of a number of kinds of providers. And so what we've got is the Oxbridge so it's the Oxbridge is the elite bit, the Russell Group is the next level down, we've got the so-called million plus, and we've got the so-called alternate providers. This shouldn't surprise us if we're following Gary Becker's work, because essentially what you don't want to do is invest huge amounts of money or have investments going in the direction of expensive investments of those who are not going to be your elite. So basically you've got your mass, which is sort of access to higher education, human capital, so this is so-called egalitarian. But it's public power that's kind of, in Nancy Fraser's kind of language, moving this forward and moving it forward in such a way that's the Competition and Markets Authority. It's the minister that appoints the Office for Students and UKRI, so they're two ministerial appointments, and essentially if the party politics kind of get it right, they direct the market through those kinds of institutions. So that's happened essentially on the back. So what we've got now is fee-paying students, 9,250 a year. That's just their fee, which they get lent from the government. Okay? And the government is underwriting, it's not the government, it's the public are underwriting this, any of the debts that are not paid back. But what you can see is that of the revenues coming into the university, so these slides, it's the student revenue line, which is the most significant. So now what you can see is that you see a socialising of the costs of research. Okay? So research is not being paid for by the capitalist, who's very dependent on this. That's being socialised, and as soon as innovations emerge, that gets spun out, outsourced, kind of quite quickly. DeepMind, any of those kinds of examples would be good examples here. And in the Cambridge ecosystem, we see many of these, GlaxoSmithKline, big entity, Microsoft, Visible, and so on. It goes in this kind of ecosphere, because essentially it's student fees, it is student money that is underwriting the research costs, because having been a kind of a senior leader in my own university there as the head of the faculty, it is social science students that significantly, and their fees, that underpin the costs of research. We don't make any money on research, and in fact actually significantly in the sciences we lose money. I think it's only engineering that makes a bit of money. The rest is actually being underwritten. And you can see it's actually the beneficiary, it's the pre-1992 universities. So now what we've got, and this in Rosa Luxemburg's kind of language is important, she argues, and she argued with Marx on this, and is that you have to have an inside and an outside. Now, her outside was beyond the nation state, forms of imperialism and so on. But there's a good case to argue, and Nancy Fraser also argues this too, is that you always have an inside-outside. So we've got the production of inequalities, okay, the inside-outside, those who've got more secure jobs, those who don't, those students who go to more elite institutions and those who don't, and then we've got kind of differentiation. So these inside-outsides are incredibly important. It's used as a mechanism of disciplining forms of exploitation, but also potentially new kinds of products, because if you want to be able to find your way not to one of the outsides but to one of the insides, you're often investing significant amounts of more money. And actually the tutoring business, it's $1 billion business to move you somehow, yeah, and we don't see much movement at all. What's driving this is an effective economy. This is my version using though they're winners and losers. And what comes with this economy, and I want to make something of this shortly, is that it affects the body. This is just not cognitive. This is actually the sense of a feeling of, as Will Davies describes it, nervous states. And he will argue in that book, which is a lovely read, this is not an alternate. This is the kind of logic or the happiness industry. These are just, they're not rival orders of worth. They're complementary orders of worth. That this affective economy generates a degree of vertigo. I've playfully used Quinn Slobodian's depiction of the 1930s and the so-called barometer vision, when the economists and the statisticians are having to kind of graph the world economy. But this vertical vision, we're invited constantly into a world that's organised vertically, okay? Horizontally too, this kind of differentiation. But the winning and losing is about how to get to the top, and the psychic energy that is expended constantly in terms of actually staying there. It operates in multiple ways at the level of nation, at the level of institution, at the level of individual, and it is incredibly pernicious, but it is incredibly effective. Look at who doesn't get involved in global rankings. Look at what country doesn't embrace it in some way. So this has been a very successful project in many senses. What we can see actually is huge increase in gross enrolment. So essentially the monies that are actually coming in student fee-based and which are actually powering these universities and underwriting, socialising the cost of research for capitalist development, pretty much, because that's there's not much money in the social sciences or humanities. The groups that do particularly well out of this are the high tariff. All of them pay a high tariff. So to some extent, you know, the reputational value of your degree from, let's say, the million-plus universities is not the same as the reputational value that you actually get out of the Oxbridge institutions. And in fact, what you can see is there's a production of a particular elite who become significant beneficiaries in there. The international student monies is also flowing through, and they flow through to particular kinds of universities. But even amongst the international students, there'll be differences. There'll be insides and outsides where your family can afford to send you. It depends on the kind of wealth of the family. It's generated really significant returns for economies like the UK. This is in the billions. For Australia, it's the third, if not fourth largest income earner of goods and services. So this is a real economy, you know. The generation of services, education services, and to try and lock it into trade agreements where what you can't have would be the threat, the Corbyn threat, for example, to more or less nationalise. There'll be an interesting, well, they're out of Europe now, so that might have been one of the beneficiaries. But they would have been caught up, in the general directive that was the EU one. So that's just to kind of make that simple point. But that comes with a huge amount of indebtedness. The figure at the moment in terms of students and student loans is 200 billion. Canada periodically has a moratorium. Basically, they because you leave the country, they've tried to chase students and their debt to different countries. For the moment, it's underwritten by the state, and Gabor writes about this as the kind of de-risking, because none of these companies, so if you're investing, let's say if you're Arden University and you're a for-profit university, venture capital backed, students actually take out the loan. If they don't pay the loan back, Arden doesn't give a toss at all. Okay, this is what's called de-risking. It's the public, and so now the public are being hit twice, aren't they? The so-called public that are paying to underwrite the socialisation of research, and the public are also paying in perpetuity in terms of the debts that are actually not being paid back. What's happening at the moment is the government is dropping the floor, that you had to earn above a certain amount and then you'd start paying back a certain amount of money. However, nevertheless, finance capital here, the state was borrowing at a very low level of interest, was barely over half of 1% or even less, but nevertheless was actually charging students something in the order of about 6%. It was pretty high. I mean, it was astonishingly high. And in fact, you would have been better off not taking out money from the state, but actually trying to take out, if you could, take out money yourself on the money market. Either way, you're borrowing money, nevertheless. There's something very interesting, nevertheless, if we look at this latest census data, because actually, if you remember, we're looking at quite a high level of those who are enrolled in education, and it would seem to me that if you're looking at something like 33.8% of those, so level 4 is having some kind of undergraduate degree or a level 4 qualification, so it's beyond secondary school, but doesn't include the kind of TAFE kinds of qualifications, that there's a fair degree of attrition kind of here. So people who've got levels of indebtedness didn't finish their degrees for various reasons, and in some cases we know they're part-time students, all kinds of kind of reasons for that. But the inside-outside also plays itself in here, because what we can see actually is young full-time first-degree entrants from low participation neighbourhoods typically are not ending up. This is no surprise here, but they're not ending up in the kinds of institutions that would actually enable them to generate the high income. So maybe they are the well-educated but low income. But what we also know, particularly around some of the work that Danny Dorling has done, is that some of that group are deeply aggrieved that the promise of the graduate premium, if they invested in themselves, in fact wasn't returned, that they are in Mac jobs. They do have a degree that they've paid out for, and that has not been returned in terms of the so-called graduate premium. The inside-outside plays itself out also in academic life. This is the UCU, which is the union, has been chasing what are called performance around 0 hours contracts. And Rosa, I'm sure you recognise this from your time, certainly when the fees came in. What you want to do is you want to spend as little as you possibly can on the labour that's actually going in, the labour that's actually going in order to produce an educated or a person with a credential. So what we've seen fundamentally is an increase in teaching-only contracts. These are typically year to year to year. They're not a full year. And typically, so you're not getting holiday pay here. They're very different kinds of contracts to people who are doing teaching and research. So there's been an escalation, 70% versus those who've got teaching and research contracts, which are the highly desirable. So essentially what's happening here in Rosa Luxemburg's kind of case is we can see forms of stratification taking place inside the academy, and it's the disciplining that's kind of going on. You kind of stick at it, and I'm not saying anything new to anyone in this room, in order for you to become part of the core and not part of the periphery. But that precarity, Wolfgang Streeck in quite a recent paper, no, it's not that recent, but 2020 writing with Dukes, basically suggests that these 0 hours contracts and these much more precarious contracts look very much like the Amazon kind of worker. And there'd be some interesting work to kind of do there, looking at the ways in which objectively the interests of the Amazon workers who have been actually organising, they're on strike at the just about to go on strike at the moment if they've not been on strike in the UK. And Amazon workers have actually been interesting about how they've managed to organise. Just a couple of little things and get to a conclusion. This is not the only thing that's then going on, is the development of the market. Once, and think of what I said about intellectual property here, and what's driving the so-called knowledge-based economy, competitive knowledge-based economy strategy, is the enclosure of knowledge as intellectual property. And think of where Google came from. All of these proprietorial venture capital-backed initiatives and so on. And in this particular case, it's not just in the UK. It enters into kind of global, as Luxembourg would say, we can't think of a national economy as if it's not part of a global world. And in this particular case, we've got shifting geopolitics, the rise of China, Australia, the Netherlands, the United States, the UK. All of them have identified the risks associated with doing research. So you can't collaborate. All of your collaborations with China have got to be managed. Huge amounts of training that goes on. The person who in charge of the institution, or in my case, my role as head of faculty was head of institution, is I have to make sure all the people in my faculty have actually got the kind of training that might recognise that, in fact, some Chinese student in your class, maybe it's a biotech kind of laboratory somewhere in Cambridge or whatever, is in there possibly representing, the Chinese government, and there's kind of really pretty nasty stuff, highly racist. The United States, they're not allowed into working in certain kinds of areas, in certain kinds of laboratories in the United States. And this is just the check sheet, but you can see it comes out of the Centre for Cyber Security here. So now what we have is knowledge, not as commons, but as enclosed, meets geopolitics in the global economy. And these knowledges are not open, and they're open to forms of espionage, fundamentally. As if that's not enough, essentially also tied up with geopolitics is the war on terror, the prevent duty that comes in, that in fact actually every academic is being tasked with, has to be trained in the identification of a potential kind of person who might become a terrorist. All of our speakers on a campus have to be vetted for the risk that they might be speaking on something. But what this has started to intersect with now is any kind of public criticism, potentially of the government. There's what's called the, this is some campaigning that's going on, No Platform for Fascism, but the government is trying to, and it's not there yet, but it's called the Free Speech Bill. Okay? So any of you that might be publicly speaking, that might be engaged in, let's say, a critique even of government policy, could be regarded as inciting. So this is, inciting the crowd. And what's also going on at the current time, right at the moment, is what's called the online safety. So now we've got the intersections of multiple kind of dynamics, forms of imperialism to do with market making, but also the way in which markets themselves as forms of knowledge enclosure actually set themselves up against other kinds of projects. Ibled has kind of talked about this, about what's going on for the level at the level of individuals, and describes this. I think it's one of Will Davies. I might misrepresent her, but students recently done a PhD at Goldsmiths, and again doing this kind of Hayekian kind of close reading of Hayek's texts, and it does bear close scrutiny. When we scrutinise Hayek's text, he's quite eugenicist. It's about the fittest survive. The argument is that the market doesn't care. The market does care. Markets are made by their socially made institutions. And so this idea of the market not kind of, but essentially it's to kind of weed out the unproductive fundamentally. So this is where I've been going in my own work with, again, several colleagues, but particularly I want to credit Michele Martini, who's postdoced with me for the last 3 years. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at the way, and over time, what happens is we see a moving away from let's say an early phase of primitive accumulation, sort of that early Deering, market-like new public management, and then we see some forms of ownership, outsourcing, that kind of thing. But most recently, and we'd put this broadly under the Washington Consensus if we wanted to, use some kind of more political kind of terms. But most recently, we argue that you can see actually the rise of finance capital. The big tech firms are moving in. Their creative models are actually rather different here. It's asset creation and rentier relations. And again, the thing that's really important here is to recognise how inventive capitalism actually is. Okay? It's not the capitalism of Marx. The capitalism of Marx, not just the those who sold their labour and those who own the means of production. There's something more complicated actually going on here. And here I've been taken particularly by Etienne Balibar's recent interventions in political economy, who's actually looking particularly at the way in which sectors like education are being kind of caught up in this. And he's describing it as absolute capitalism, where processes of commodification and the creation of fictitious commodities, because human beings aren't commodities in that kind of sense, but nevertheless they are kind of the object of processes of commodification. And to quote, absolute capitalism is a steady process of commodification or creation of new fictitious commodities, without which the process of accumulation cannot be maintained. But it leads into the incorporation of reproduction processes at the biological level, at the intellectual level, so our knowledge, at the symbolic level, but the biological, it's kind of our bodies, and kind of valorising all of these, both forming value, but also kind of it's new additional kinds of value that are actually being kind of created. And this process of commodification, says Balibar, is operating both at the level of production through forms of production and exploitation, but also at the level of consumption. So we're consuming education, and a certain kind of education which starts to discipline us in very particular kinds of ways. And it would be what I'm describing as the privatising through. That in fact actually in a Gramscian kind of sense is the interiorisation and of that kind of accumulation strategy. So this is all pretty not surprising in many senses, but there's a long distance from the kind of Piketty kind of analysis, in my view. And it's this kind of analysis, I think, in education that we need to engage with. Because there are things like, I mean, can you believe it? I could sell, if a venture capitalist wants to buy a little bit of my future in return for the earnings that I might get, there are mechanisms to do that right now, peer-to-peer lending. Okay? Now, the venture capitalist is not going to, let's say, lend to you unless it checks out what kind of family, what kind of cultural, economic forms of capital sit behind you, the kind of industry that they expect you to go into. But right now, right at the moment, there's a very live and well industry. Many of these venture capitalists have come out of Airbnb and Google, and engaging in these kinds of new products. Initially came out of Chile, but in fact actually they've pushed social impact bonds, human capital contracts, and so on. So again, it's when you begin to interiorise, you act like the owner of yourself as a form of commodity, and with property relations. And not in the sense that John Locke was kind of describing, to do with actually having the right to begin to contract. This is something much more pernicious. So what's to be done? And I don't want to, these are students outside Cambridge, having a lovely conversation earlier around how it's been noted internationally, how politicised the Cambridge students have become. Many of them, my students actually, driving some of these as organisers, and their doctoral students, organisers, campaigners, and so on. So I would also want to suggest that we can look to the left in many senses. This devastating and withering critique that's just come out from Nancy Fraser, Cannibal Capitalism, because fundamentally her argument is two things. One is you can't get commodification all the way down. You can't. Essentially, when you've got the inside-outside, capitalism always wants to not pay for some things. So it needs social reproduction, and it needs to kind of keep this inside, kind of outside kind of happening. So we do see it's not a kind of flat ontological kind of process here, and we get winners and we get losers, don't we? And so what one would actually want would be to galvanise, to mobilise at least some of the losers, and to actually see that those who are losing, it's not the migrant population who are that you want to turn on as the losers. As the losers, objectively, those who are the white working class losers are objectively in the same position as anyone with ethnic backgrounds and so on it goes. So stitching together that kind of coalition is going to be really important. One can't underestimate the work that's going to take, because the way it's bifurcating at the moment, if you run with the first kind of analysis, is you've got a kind of cosmopolitan, more globally oriented elite who wouldn't see that they've got anything in common with, let's say, a more nationalising, wanting to go after your jobs, somewhat nativist and so on. And something going forward has got to be able to kind of give. We see, it seems to me, some real insights from Luxemburg's work, the importance of the spontaneous, she would argue, the importance of institution building, she also says, the importance of certain kinds of institutions that would underpin social democracy that might move to somewhere else. And she was a believer in the institutions of social democracy that might be able to move us in the direction of that kind of more thoroughgoing kind of critique of capitalism. Straight kind of thinks that essentially it'll all just implode, but we'll all go down with it. But, I mean, it's easy to say that, isn't it? I mean, if we look at the inventiveness of capitalism, and finance capital, which essentially Rigi will say it's got its you see finance capital in the twilight years, but it's been astonishingly kind of inventive here. There's a big debate raging at the moment between some of the best minds, really, around, do we see the rise of techno-feudalism, which I think would be a great new theme for another series of the Luxembourg, because in fact it has forced some of the key writers that include Fraser, Morozov, all of them kind of in there, Durand, to try and think again about how do we understand capitalism and how is it different from feudalism, and so on. So let's just conclude. My own position on this is that higher education needs to be analysed in the context of 21st century capitalism and its accumulation strategies, of which it is a part, both in terms of the production of the kind of social reproduction, but also increasingly the production of fictitious commodities and so on. We saw that it got embraced as part of the knowledge economy, I'm going to say not society, strategies, where huge amounts of work has actually gone in over the last 30 years, the multilateral institutions, the corporates, the McKinseys of this world, and so on. What's important, I think, in what I've tried to argue is that Luxembourg's insights about both the world economy and society, and also the inside-outside kinds of dynamics that are fundamental to understanding what we're actually looking at here. Because for Marx, essentially, there would be a moment of exhaustion, whereas that capacity to be incredibly inventive, well, you've got Bezos going off to Mars, hasn't he? New commodities like education produce the means for the productive sector, reproduction, as well as producing the subjects themselves, where individuals are not just exploited, but also are transformed. And I'll just give you the example that one of my PhD students is kind of working with. As Chile went to the left, the school children became the university, protesters became the politicians. And it's difficult, they're finding it difficult to have a parent say, if you want to put state-funded education on the table, they say, we want the right to pay for education. It is so internalised, so interiorised, that in fact actually this idea that it's a commodity, that you're paying for, organised through many for-profit firms that operate in the education world in Chile. And so the question of how, if we're looking at Chile, which was the laboratory in the 80s, as the laboratory at the current time for how do we actually unmake the market, it's not straightforward, but nevertheless, I do want to say, making the market wasn't straightforward either. And it's not properly landed. It's not put beyond politics, I'd say, still at the moment. The state is in there. When it's put beyond politics in a very secure way, that's when state or public power essentially enables this to just become part of the normal kind of common sense. Are there limits to commodification? A number of writers kind of think and say that there is, in which case there's always social life that isn't commodified, but nevertheless is typically available to be put to work for the processes of commodification, because in fact certain kind of markets also fail. But my sense is for Luxembourg, and this is where I would probably part company a little bit with Eric, oh no, not so much Eric Olin Wright. Eric Olin Wright, and wonderful scholar, died several years back, did try to do the work of real utopias. Could we imagine concretely, and what would that begin to look like? I have a PhD student currently, and Alex Trinidad, who's currently working on the University for the Landless Peasant Movement and popular universities and so on. So we have examples in places like Brazil of, and even the World Social Forum would put itself up as a kind of more popular social movement site for education and so on. So amassing some of these examples of alternatives also become quite significant, it would seem to me. And so I just want to leave it there to say thank you, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Susan. That was super interesting. Now, have we got any questions? The floor is yours. Have we got any questions from you? George and I always have questions, but we try to hold back. Can we get the microphone? It's just for the recording. Yeah, because we're recording this. Thank you.
I was interested if you could say a little bit more about the forms of stratification when you were talking about the enclosure of education. Was it?
Yeah, so the forms of vertical and horizontal stratification become important in the sense of this becomes, in Luxembourg's kind of terms, the other. You could be part of the precariat, okay? That's also the destination, okay? So it works, and I'd probably say Nancy Fraser's using this inside-outside dynamic in a really sophisticated way now, and it doesn't just apply to, in Luxembourg's case, it would have been, you know, non-capitalist societies. You know, it'd be a bit hard to find where some of them might actually be now. But if we take what Luxembourg's trying to tell us, and that is that there's always spheres of social life that could be potentially incorporated, that might have included also, we think of the UK, you know, old areas that have been deindustrialised, there's no investment going in, and then there's a kind of new kind of making over. Okay, so this dynamic of inside operates in relation to those who are excluded, who are also exploited. Fundamental to keep this here. Okay, so they're part of it. They're engaged in the social reproduction of this over here, but they're also part of, and she would think of, you know, domestic work, house, you know, people who in fact actually labour but don't get paid, for example. It's fundamentally important, but engage in all the work to do with social reproduction and so on. But I think we can work quite dynamically with this inside-outside, and it'd work all the different ways in which these inside-outsides kind of, because if it was a flat structure, there's no dynamic in here. There's no competition, okay? Capitalism works with competition, yeah? And this competition and the fear, the anxiety to do with precarity, and the possibilities, what I'm calling vertical vision, yeah? That's a really important kind of dynamic of keeping us engaged in this. But it's disciplining.
As well.
Very disciplining, yeah, absolutely. Exploitative, disciplining, yeah.
Is there a question from someone else?
So, thank you a lot. It was a great talk. I have some thoughts. First of all, I found very interesting the way you have conceptualized, you know, the way that, you know, the interconnection between the market and the university and in general the knowledge. But I found, I mean, your last idea about specific concrete utopias of Eric Olin Wright. So I want to make it specific. So I'm wondering why, for example, I mean the Labour Party of Corbyn in the past few years before, you know, to be dissolved, to which extent did not include in its programmatic and pre-electoral campaign and its claims, you know, the marketization of the university. I mean, in the sense that, I mean, shouldn't be a claim, I mean, on behalf of the left, that this type of privatization of everything should stop. I mean, and I mean with specific ways. I mean, to say that cancel the student debt, or I mean, and to, you know, because I mean, this type of condition was not always like this. It was 2011, and you know, this type of reform. So universities in the United Kingdom was not always, you know, in the way they have been nowadays. So this is one thing that I find interesting, and also what you argued about, you know, who are the people. In reality, it is in the theory of revolution. I mean, the people who revolt, I mean, are those with, I mean, who are, have already lost something and they want it back, not the people who are, you know, in, let's say, they don't have anything. So, because you said something about who goes to the right, who goes to the left, I mean, that, and also, I want to say that, of course, I mean, does not mean that if you have, you know, an education, that this necessarily will lead somewhere to, you know, or it is enough to become a leftist or whatever. It is much more complicated than this. And I found your talk very, you know, useful in this type of deconstructing of Piketty's argument.
So, if I just think of your first question and the Corbyn's agenda, it was huge. There were huge rifts in the Labour Party. Yeah. And in fact, actually, Corbyn was as surprised as anyone that they actually managed to get sufficient vote. And that was young people organising, actually. The kind of so-called Corbynistas. You know, very much like in the Bernie Sanders kind of case. But there were many in the Labour Party who, you know, did, you know, the kind of Blairite group, more or less, who saw that this was actually political suicide as well. So we had the potential, you know, if you looked at the kind of agenda that Corbyn kind of put out, it would be to actually have education, higher education, as a public good. Okay, and actually, if you think of it at the moment, you know, if the state is significantly underwriting, I think they've dropped the floor so that it's about 40% now. It's about 60% is potentially going to be paid back, and 40% that won't be. The public is kind of playing twice, you know, here. You almost want to say, you know, you could even just do some quite straight kind of talking here. You know, you pay for your degree, and then you maybe you don't pay it back, but nevertheless, at some point, a future generation's going to be paying back a significant amount of money kind of going into the future. But there's a wing of the Labour Party, and that in fact actually has an eye on winning the so-called next election, and it's a continuous kind of thread through from the Blair kind of years. Brown doesn't deviate, and many of those policies that I kind of showed you, essentially, all of them are pretty much. It was the Brown Review was commissioned under Labour. It was several policies. You know, it was the globally competitive policies of Mendelssohn, for example, that drive all of those. So Labour's deeply kind of complicit, kind of in that there. But the second question that you actually ask, I mean, it's not always the case that it's those who've lost something, and I was quite kind of pleasantly really surprised as we were organising some of the first kind of teach-ins and that kind of stuff. You know, really top drawer professors of mathematics were out there with loudspeakers, you know, and they had secure jobs at Cambridge, so you're not going to be booted out as a young professor out of a maths department. in Cambridge. And they were on the picket line and organising and so on. So, I mean, it would be, how do you win the hearts and minds of also those who, you know, in this case, they have secure jobs, okay, they might be being docked pay. But I was just saying much earlier that, in fact, actually, there would be, even in the institution, there'd be a memorandum that would come to us, and I was head of faculty. Name all the people that were out on the picket line or not turning up to teach their classes, and send them through, and we'll be docking. Well, a bunch of us who are middle-level managers said no. We were not going to do that. This is absolutely not what we're going to do. If you want to do it, you do it yourself, but not us. Don't. And a number of us actually got together to figure out how we would support and in solidarity stand as middle-level head of a faculty on the picket line in solidarity, but also at times I knew I had to go. So I would just have conversations with colleagues on the picket line, the organisers, about this is when I could be there, this is when I won't be able to be there. That kind of, and it made for a different kind of politics. It made for a different kind of engagement, because the threat's actually about how much money is coming out of your pay packet, and for, you know, if you're on a 0 hours contract, you know, I mean, there's no money that day you work. If you manage to get that work, that's the money that you've actually got kind of coming in and so on. But, you know, let me just say, I mean, there's strikes up and down the country at the moment. The nurses, the physiotherapists, the Amazon workers, the doctors, the train drivers. I mean, it's going off in the direction of what Luxembourg would absolutely have loved, which is almost getting, you know, a bit of a general strike kind of taking place. And in part, it's kind of driven for the Amazon workers. They've figured out how much money Amazon made. Each Amazon worker could be paid, is the calculation at the moment, £91,000, and there would still be billions and billions left for Bezos, essentially, in his account. And I guess in the organising of our kind of left campaigns, it's that kind of, I mean, it would be the kind of fact-finding and campaigning that Rosa herself did, you know, constantly on it, constantly reading, constantly looking at what's going on in different bits of the world. She was an extraordinary woman. Her ability to write, describe, know what was going on, travel, you know, what was going on in different bits of the world. My sense is, and this is where she was very determined that she was right, that you've got to get beyond kind of the nationalisms of the nation and actually get a broad coalition going forward. And I've tried to engage with Education International as a mechanism for potentially kind of doing that, commissioning pieces of research, figuring out what we might think would be the killer facts. You know, when the Panama Papers came out, for example, if we looked at how much money was stashed in the tax havens, that was the sort of money that if you wanted to get every kid into school, that's where you'd find it. Now you just need political will, democratic social institutions to actually engage in some of that kind of thing.
That's very interesting. Oh, can you hear me? Doesn't work?
No.
No. Oh, it's yours. It was yours. Okay, thank you. Your talk made me think a lot, Susan. We have a very different condition here in Greece, and I was very interested. I mean, I had the experience of the UK before coming here, and I was in position to observe how neoliberalism got deeper and deeper in higher education after the Brown report. On the other hand, you know, because we live here and we think about, I was very interested by what you say about stitching coalitions. How do we create that? With whom? And that precarity is not something that is exclusive to ethnic minorities anymore, but it spreads the precarity of contracts. Here in Greece, we have a very different situation in the universities, a very different condition that creates exclusions of other sorts. So, for instance, we have a public education, publicly funded, so you pay zero money to attend university, in very different conditions. As I told you earlier, I was teaching at Pantheon University, and I found myself with 900 scripts to mark for 500 euros a month. So a very precarious position anyway. But then, you know, the Greek university is notoriously corrupt in the sense that how do we build coalitions from those who are inside the university, who keep those who are outside the university? What do we do while having this condition, a corrupt university of gatekeepers who don't want to let others in, with a neoliberal government, essentially an alt-right neoliberal government, who are really aiming at putting an end at public education? And I do think that this is going to be the case in the next 5 years. I think there's going to be systematic efforts to end, in some form, public education. And you see the argument. It's already happening because it's so underfunded that you can't survive there. I mean, I had to teach in classes with no heating, with the bathrooms have no light or water. The conditions are terrible. And it is devalued from all sides, from the teaching staff, from the academics who are here, from the students as well, because they don't get what they deserve. I mean, it's a public education, but it's very depressing to be part of that, condition, with a government who are very aggressive and no, essentially, political voice in the sense of representation in the parliament or representation in the elections. No one is arguing on a serious basis of what's going to happen to public education, how do we organize ourselves, how do we make this better. So I was, you know, on the one hand, I felt, you know, thinking about it at a deadlock. On the one hand, you've got capitalism and venture capitalism and that conditions you described to us and which is known across the world. And on the other hand, we've got a, you know, kind of like feudal university here, whether you are associated with someone by family ties or via clientelism, by belonging to the main political parties. So, you know, it's not so much a question, it's a question. I thought, how do we move forward, knowing, and my sense is that once the neoliberal policy is going to come to Greece, it's going to devastate everything because there's nothing holding all this thing together. So it's mostly, I don't know, a question, what is to be done? What should we do?
So, I mean, my first response is it's that kind of diagnosis. So, I mean, this, you know, you're educated and it makes assumptions, doesn't it, about the kinds of institutions that people are educated in, okay? That's the problem with some of those first kind of iterations. And so you'll just have more of that. In what you've just described, having more of that is more of kind of patronage, clientelism, all of those kind of social relations. Joran Thurbon, and this is where I sit too, is that and it's why I've done a specific case of England, not Scotland, and not Wales. They have different fee structures. Okay, no one's basically saying that they're running out of money at all. You know, and they've managed to continue with enough pressure in there. So what we need is the kind of granular kind of analysis around the institutions within territories, I would probably say, in relation to particular forms of political organisation or forms of public power, their relationships to different forms of capital, venture capitalism popping up everywhere, finance capital and so on. I mean, it's looking, and it's also looking for the bits of education. It's very acute at where it thinks it wants to invest. It doesn't want to invest in you know, the mass. I mean, it's got no interest in that. It's interested in investing in those bits. And I've seen actually the analyses of where the investors, Holland IQ is a good example at the moment of a company that provides information to investors as to where the most profits are to be kind of extracted. So my view is that we need not the kind of analysis that is anodyne and very anodyne, the first kind of accounts. Not the kind of analysis that Piketty is putting up either. What we need is the kind of analysis that I'm trying to present and where sociologists, political economists, and so on are also trying to get a much more kind of complex understanding of the dynamics of capitalism and the way in which it's actually working. Mostly what we've got on the table, if we're looking at privatising an education, is those kind of first two, in and of. But in fact, actually, what we're calling the, following a few other writers, the Wall Street consensus. There's some very complex things actually going on, and we need them in the frame, because essentially you can't do the kind of you can't do the work of imagination and campaign development and things like that unless you've got a pretty good diagnosis of what is it that's going on. And it doesn't look all the same everywhere. You know, if you went down to Brazil, you'll find in the universities the elite institutions are publicly funded, and the private institutions are where the out group go, as it were. Lula did a little bit about trying to get scholarships for some of them, but they're into, nevertheless, the private institutions. They're not elite institutions. They do not take you in the direction of the well-paid jobs and so on. So the social formations and their institutions will represent class strategies. They absolutely do. And those class strategies from territory to territory to territory actually do differ. We know in England it's the so-called public schools that are the big feeders. It's not new to anyone here, but nevertheless, in Australia we don't have that kind of set of institutional arrangements. And so, again, it's good diagnosis, informed diagnosis of the kind of diagnosis, I think, where we're also willing to build a language of description, to theorise, to not just hark back to, well, Marx didn't say this or Marx said this. You know, the world has changed, and our responsibility as intellectuals, doesn't matter where we are, as intellectuals caring, concerned to analyse what's actually going on, is to also do the job as Balabar is doing. And it's well worth a good read, and I'm happy to send a reference list, to actually try and develop a language for ourselves around the rise of finance capital. You know, what are we looking at with these big techno firms? Don't pay any tax, you know, and yet if you've basically got of those 5 big companies there, the wealth of Germany, France and the UK, that's serious wealth that's privately owned, that's not in public institutions, because in fact they don't pay tax. Yeah. Even some tax would go a long way.
But we get taxed 6% as students if we get a student loan in the list, at least in the UK, yes? Something like that? How much is it?
Oh, no, the interest rate would... no, the government pocketed the interest rate.
The government, okay.
Yeah. And to be fair to Piketty and colleagues, they are pushing on the front of taxation. You know, and Wolfgang Streeck, who's a real, I love his work, Buying Time. So you can see he kind of thinks it's imploding, but it argues very persuasively, in my view, that what we've seen is a shift from the tax state to the debt state. And at the moment, I can see this in the Conservative. They want to drop taxes for the wealthy. It's the one thing, I think, was it Stiglitz, who was the advisor to Clinton at the time, regrets significantly that he advised them to drop the corporate rate of tax.
He keeps writing, but it's 20 years down the line, so...
Yeah, but that was the advice to the Clinton administration.
Yeah,
and he regrets that. Yeah. He says that was actually a real mistake. Yeah. And it's obvious why that would actually be the case. But at the moment, essentially, short of, you just go into a cheaper space. Ireland is a good example. There's some moves to, lift the... If you're not paying 20%, then... because I think it's at 15% corporate tax in Ireland, then they've got to make up the difference of the 5%. But I don't know how they're all going to work out. But because education, our institutions of social reproduction are, in that sense, dependent on taxation systems
more or less, otherwise you've got private means, then essentially in order to have some degree of the social contract kind of honoured there. So anyway, I'd say good thorough diagnosis, a good rereading of Luxembourg, to also be inspired by her as a campaigner, as someone right back then also being incredibly aware of the exploitation of nature. There's a lot to work with Luxembourg, but there's also a lot of work that we've got to do.
Thank you very much, Susan. Are there any more questions? If there aren't, let me thank Susan Robertson. Thank you so much, Susan, for this fascinating talk. Thank you for joining us.
Great pleasure.
And personally, thank you for always supporting our new ventures and our new plans and projects. Thank you very much for attending today. Let me remind you that you have another seminar coming up in 2 weeks from now. George, this is the 10th, is it? The 10th of February. And we'll have Kanishka Guenaverdana, who is going to talk to us about neoliberalism in Sri Lanka, crisis protest and left strategy. So we'll be waiting for you here. Thank you very much.